We wanted to feature some South Carolina history makers for Black History Month at the Big DM. And I mentioned to you earlier, we have a list of people who are dead and gone on, and we have a list of people who are still making history even today.
Yes.
And your name kept coming up over and over, and we wanted to talk to you about some of the contributions you made for the state of South Carolina and the country as well.
Yes, okay.
It seems like at a very early age, you had a fire in your belly to kind of make a difference in your state, make a difference in the plight of African Americans, even as young as 14, 15, 16 years old. Dr. Sellers, where did that come from?
Well, I think that came from the kind of upbringing for me.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up pretty much on this college campus and Denmark Technical College campus. My mother was a professor here at Voorhees College for a number of years, and then she went from Voorhees over to South Carolina Area Trade School, as it was referred to then, but Denmark Tech. And so I think that if you understand the history of Voorhees, it comes out of the Booker T. Washington tradition. Matter of fact, it's an offspring of Booker T. Washington in the sense that the founder, a 23-year-old black female who graduated from Tuskegee Institute, was sent on a mission by Booker T. Washington to build schools and educate young, newly freed slaves and not so newly freed slaves who needed an opportunity to get an education, but it wasn't being provided by either the state or local communities. And so she came and she set her lot in Denmark after she was burned out on 3 different occasions. And she began to put the school together in the same tradition as Booker T. Washington. She was a mentee of her, of his wife, Booker T. Washington's wife, when she was at Tuskegee. And Booker T. Washington passed on all of the philosophy and the practices and principles of Tuskegee, an industrial institution. And she, Booker T. Washington thought that African Americans need to know how to use their hands and their minds, and they needed to know how to get into those industries that would make a good living for them and provide for a stable, sturdy family. And when you're talking about that, you're talking about the kind of educational curriculum. You might remember that there was his industrial education, that he thought that African Americans need to know how to do work.
Yeah.
And so he believed in the industrial education. And later you have Du Bois, who is coming along, who is challenging that, saying that you had to have a liberal arts education, which included the arts and the sciences and the other kinds of areas that go along with that, history, philosophy, those kinds of things, which gave you a very humanistic kind of education, but in a liberal arts kind of setting.
So you came from educators, so I guess going to college, you didn't really have a choice. Why Howard University?
Well, Howard University was out of a number of institutions I was considering, and one of those institutions was the University of South Carolina. But I understood that I couldn't go, and I had already created some friction between me and my father about my activism.
Yes.
And so what I was really looking for is I was looking for a place in which it was a rich activist kind of community. And I thought that Howard, being the largest of the HBCUs, that it would have the largest contingency and would have the kind of atmosphere that would be welcoming to my presence at Howard University. Now I was in for a rude awakening, and that was also a part of how I began to understand and appreciate the movement and the principles of the movement and who it is that we were actually fighting for and what it was that we were actually fighting for. We were fighting for basic principles: justice, equality, to end segregation as we knew it, and to combat racism to the extent we could. And so there were processes and tactics that were employed, the first being the sit-ins and students were the driving force behind that, and the students at most of the HBCUs engaged in some kind of practice. Now, it all didn't turn out the same way, but what it did was it meant that your commitment and your dedication was going to be much larger. And I tell people, if you think about that and you say, oh, they just went down and asked for some coffee, they didn't get it, they went back to the rooms, or they were arrested and went to jail. But most of those students in school at that particular time, they were the child that was going to make it out.
Yeah.
They were going to make it out. So they had to risk, getting put out of school. They had to risk going to jail and what that might have done to them in terms of their education, and risk the opportunity to uplift the family, not just themselves, but the family, because you were expected to go out, develop these skills, get yourself a job, and then begin to reach back and lift others up, provide services to that community that provided for you to get out of that community. So there was a lot of risk. And so that is where the commitment kind of comes, that you at first commit yourself. And then as the movement moved on into like freedom rides and then voter registration in places like Mississippi, which were hostile to the notion of black people registering to vote, you had to, in fact, request others to put themselves at risk. And for a 16, 17, 18-year-old, like many of us were, it was quite a adventure to go into somebody's home and sit there and tell them, I need you to go down and register to vote. And they said, well, terrible things will probably happen. And you had to say, yes, I understand that. So it was a maturation of growing up and actually taking on those responsibilities. The only thing we could tell them is we would go with them. We would go with them, but that's all we could assure them. And that we would do everything that was possible to try to right whatever ills came out of that particular experience. So it wasn't just a cavalier kind of, oh, they sitting in and I'm gonna go. There was a lot of thought that had to go into that, and people risk almost everything as they moved up the line. And then when you got to the point where you put families at risk, I had cases in which the families' homes were shot in that night after they had gone to try to register to vote. I've had cases in which they lost their jobs the next day. Some cases, Fannie Lou Hamer, for an example, an outspoken person in the Mississippi voting rights movement, her home was fired in the next day, that night, and the next day the owner of the house came and told her she was out. She had to go, but she had already had to escape to another county, and she got her family out. But that's the kind of terror that we were actually engaged in and involved in through that whole era of the 1960s.